Well, good morning. It's still morning, 5 minutes. How's everybody doing today? Pretty good. It's good to be here. I'm Phil. I'm one of the pastors here at the church. And as you know, we are going through a study on work. It's our second part of a three-part series. And as last week, some of you thought, hold off, it's not Monday yet, so we're going to be okay. We're talking about work, but it's going to be a good thing. And I fear, though, we'd break it up a little bit to start out. We're going to give a little parenting advice for you. It's related to work, but just to shake things up a little bit, give you a little hope. Here's a parenting tip for today. Here it goes. Treat a difficult child the way you would your boss at work. You got that? So treat your child like you would your boss at work. Praise his achievements, ignore his tantrums, and resist the urge to sit him down and tell him his brain is not yet fully developed. That's funny. I wouldn't recommend that. Work. Last week we talked about work view. What's God's 10,000 foot level view of work? What is the story of work? And we had a 4-part story we talked about, and the first part of the story was remember? Work view. What was the first part of the 4-part story though? The creation, the garden. Good. The garden. And in the garden, we saw that God was a worker. We saw that men and women were image bearers of God, and therefore they were what as well? Workers. Good. They were workers as well. And Adam and Eve were able to freely work in the garden as worship of God. And their work was good and fulfilling, as God's was work and fulfilling. And the second part of the story was the fall. There we go. Was the fall. And there was there's two portions to it. The working conditions changed and the worker changed. The working conditions changed because the very ground itself was cursed, and work became toilsome and difficult and unfulfilling and in vain. And work was now an obligation to live, to get your food, and it was hard. We also saw that the worker changed, and the worker changed in that he became selfish. He was, how can I do this for my name, for myself? It was a form of idolatry. But then we saw the good news of the gospel. We saw the good news of the gospel. In the gospel, the worker's heart was changed. However, what wasn't changed? The working conditions were not changed. That's right, the working conditions. We're still in this time where the ground is cursed and things are hard and toilsome. But someday in part 4, the new heaven and the new earth, all things will be restored. That's what we saw. That's the view of work. And we saw from that work is a good thing. We also saw that because of the fall, though, work became very hard. And we also found that we were made for work, but not for ourselves, for God. And that's what we saw. Today, we're going to take a view of that one era in which we live right now, which is the era of the gospel. The fall has happened, the gospel has come, there's this good news, but we're not in heaven yet. And we're going to look at that because why? That's where we live, and that's what we're going to focus on. How do we live Christian lives right now in the way? This message today is called Christian at Work. Christian at work. And in that place, as we know, there's this brokenness, but we have the very Spirit of God in us. And we can live for Christ because the Spirit of Christ lives in us. Today we're going to answer 2 questions. And the first one is, what makes our Christian work distinct? So what's the difference between a Christian work and someone else's work? And then how do we work in this environment? Will and Holly Howell, they're part of our home fellowship, and they both have forms of work. How do they work in that environment? Will, he's a blue-collar worker. He works as a lineman. He's the guy who, when the power goes out, he's out there all night fixing the power lines and so on. And he's good at what he does. He enjoys it. He can climb those poles pretty fast and so on. And he, in a job environment, though, he told us at his home fellowship, where the guys are rough and basically they're against Christ, and they're looking for any way in which they can kind of find weakness in you to kind of put you down or beat you down. This is the environment he works in. How does he live as a Christian in that environment? How does Holly, who's a stay-at-home mom, how does she, with 4 kids, trying to homeschool them, manage the home, how does she live as a Christian worker distinctly? And these are the questions we're going to answer. And I think they apply very much to each and every one of us. Before we jump into just how do we do that, though, I want to stop and begin to think a little bit more about what is the motivation behind this? Why are we even doing this study on work, and what motivates this? The reason we're doing this is the world in which we live needs a whole, complete Christian. And really, a Christian is not a whole, complete Christian. It is really not what a Christian's supposed to be. But we need whole, complete Christians. And we need it first personally. Why do we need it personally? Because to have fellowship with Christ, we need to be living our lives with Christ all the time. And we need it because when we don't do that, there's a sense of shame and guilt that rises up. And there's this computing part in our heart, this thing in our heart that hurts. Secondly, we need it because the society needs it. The society needs to see whole, complete Christians as a witness of the truth of Christ, a whole person. Now, what do I mean when I'm talking about this? If you've observed, and I'm sure you have, our culture has been attacked by the enemy in this way. When people work, they work really hard. When people play, they play really hard. And when people worship, they worship really hard. But those things don't intermix in a lot of ways. You worship here, you play here, you work here. And this is it's a divided culture. It's a divided place in the church as well at times. And it makes great sense if you don't have the Spirit of God in you, because it's a great way to just sort of please your conscience. You can have your religion here. You can do your philanthropy. You can be an activist in this area and appease the conscience. But then over here, you can have as much fun you want and fulfilling in your play. You can make money the way you'd like to make money, and you can gain success in the way that you'd like to do it. It's divided. You can appease your conscience and do this thing you want to do over here. And this is contrary to what we are as Christians. This is a lie that the enemy has put into our culture and into many Christians. We have faith in our life. We have the sacred and then the secular. We have the church and the world. And I know for many of you, I know for myself, there's a cry inside of it that says, God, I want to live for you at all times. But I have to go to work. I have to do these things. What do I do with that? And there's a wrestling there. Let me give you an example of how our culture has done this. Recently, I guess it's been more than recently now, we now have genderless marriage in our state now, right? This isn't a political talk. But the same thing is happening now on the national level. Right now, the Senate is passing legislation about work discrimination. So in the sense that if someone comes in your place, right now you can't, versus a race or religion, people can be, you can't decide if you're going to hire or fire based on that. And the same thing is true, doing the same thing for a person who's saying they're homosexual. And there's one group that disagrees with that, and that's the religious. And so what the laws do and what the Congress people do in the Senate, they make an exception. And the exception says, if you are a religious organization, a church, or a nonprofit in that way, then you can decide whether or not if you'd like to do that or not. Now, this sounds good on the surface, but what it does is it just reinforces this divide. Because Christians, you live out in the world. And just because you go out into the world doesn't mean your Christianity dies. It means that you have to live with this on a business owner. They have to now live with that, even if no matter what you are. And so there's this divide. And the problem, I don't fault the culture with that at all, actually. It totally makes sense if that's that's the culture. But the problem is for the Christian. And what is the Christian response to many of these things? The Christian response is disengagement. When we disengage, basically in three ways. The first way is we renounce it. We say, I disagree with that, and I'm not going to have any part of it. So I'm going to stay away from that. The second way the Christian culture a lot of times does it is say, okay, we're going to create a Christian subculture, in which, example, we create our own music. We can create our own movies. Heather and I recently watched a Christian movie, and it was fun to watch it, but the acting is not so good. We create these subcultures. There's the same thing in schooling, in clubs. Pastor John Corson, who is one of my favorite teachers, he says that this Christian subculture, Christians, when we gather together like that, are like manure. Manure is good when it spreads out, but manure stinks when it's all together. And that's kind of the way it can be for Christians. We come together like that. And the third way we do it is there's an unhealthy embrace. So, I'm going to allow that to kind of come be part of my Christianity. So we renounce it, we create a Christian social culture, or we embrace it. And these are all things that cause trouble. And the problem with this is because what happens is it renders our Christianity functionally irrelevant. So what does that mean? It means that the theology of the Christianity, that we're sinners and we know that, and we have fallen natures and we can be saved by Jesus Christ. But what does it actually do? It does nothing. It doesn't change the person. It doesn't change our families. It doesn't change our workplaces. It doesn't change society. It's functionally irrelevant. It might be true, but it doesn't change anything. And this is unattractive to the world, and it looks very fake. People can just see it. That's fake. That's not real when it's not a whole thing. And so I hope we can see that ourselves. We need this personally, and we need it as a society. I want you to turn to the book of Esther, chapter 4. And I'm going to do a little summary of Esther, but we're going to be looking at Esther chapter 4. It'll be one verse when we get there. It's in the Old Testament. You go through 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs. So Esther's right there. In the book of Esther, there's a plot, and then there's another plot kind of that happened at the same time, parallel plots. And in the first part of the plot, we have a king. And his name is Ahasuerus. He's the king of Persia. And his wife does something very disrespectful to him. And so he and the other guys say this can't happen, so they put her out. And after a while, though, the king decides, I'd really like to have a wife. I'd like to have a queen. And so they decide that every beautiful woman in the kingdom is to be brought to him. And he's going to spend a night with each one. Now, looking at that as a service, you're thinking, wow, that seems kind of unethical and so on, but I'm sure the king was thinking, let's give this guy a raise. So he does that. He probably did. And in that, he says, Esther comes, she's a Jewish woman, she takes part in the contest, and he chooses Esther. She is the one who pleases him, and she becomes his queen. Now, right away, we're thinking, again, this isn't right. How can a Jewish woman allow herself to this happen to her? That she comes in with a night with a king, and then he chooses her, doesn't choose her, and then goes away. How is that right? Is it wrong that she's part of that culture? Now the second plot happens. A man named Haman, who's an arrogant man. He's glory-loving. He's a prince, and he's second only to the king. And he's so arrogant that he demands that everyone, as he walks by, is supposed to bow down to him. Imagine that. And there's another man named Mordecai, and he's a Jew, also a Jew. He's actually the uncle of Esther. And he decides, I'm not going to be a part of this. I'm not going to bow before him. He's not going to conform to the culture that's around him. And because of that, because he doesn't conform to the culture, there's consequences. And Haman decides, I'm going to kill Mordecai, but he says, before that, I'm just going to exterminate all the Jews just to get rid of them all. I'm done with them. And so his diabolical plot is then given a stamp of approval by King Ahasuerus. And this is where our plot 1 and plot 2 come together. Esther, who's the queen now, and Jewish, she becomes aware of the plot through Mordecai, and she's told that she needs to use her place of privilege to help. It's going to be a great risk to her life, and if she makes this stand. And this is where this most famous verse comes to pass in Esther chapter 4, verse 14. It says, "For if you remain completely silent at this time," Mordecai speaking to Esther, "relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place." So even if you don't do something, there's going to be help, Mordecai says, but you and your father's house will perish. There's going to be consequences for you. But then he says, "Yet who knows whether you have come to this kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther is the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention the name of God. That's kind of interesting the first time you learn that. The only book in the Bible. And Esther is in a culture in which the name of God, the Jewish God, has no place. And she is faced with a decision right now. She has to decide, well, am I going to stay silent and safe, or is she going to reveal her nationality before these people and put herself at risk? Now, this is basically where you and I are today. Not to this same extreme, but do we keep our faith separate, or do we engage? Do we live our life in pieces, or do we take this place that each of us has been given in the culture, your jobs, where you are, your schools that you might volunteer in, all these things, and use it? Do we engage or disengage? And what Esther does, it says here, that she risked it all, and it paid off in a huge way, right? So Mordecai was exalted to a new place, Haman was killed and defeated, and her people were saved. It was an amazing story. But the choice that she made, if she didn't make the choice, there would have been some bad consequences. If she didn't make the choice, the Jews would have been slaughtered societally. They would have lived on, though, because God always cares for his people. But secondly, personally, Esther would have been enslaved to her palace. She wouldn't have made a stand for God, so now her new ruler would have been the palace. And in addition to that, just like we have shame and guilt when we don't live complete lives, she would have had shame and guilt for the rest of her life of what she had done for what happened to her people. And that's what had happened to her personally. So we as Christians, it's so very important. We have a place that the Lord has given us. Jason, who works for Bear Painting, was here last service. He recently moved to the area, or it's been several months back, but he moved to the area and he got a job at Bear Paint. And he didn't understand why he would move to Seattle. He never thought he would. But just last week he told me there was a person in his workplace that there was no other Christians there. And he needed someone to speak into his life the things of the Lord. Each one of us has a place that we've been given by God to be used. The same thing is true. Mark Bethune, yesterday at the men's breakfast, he told us that the safest place you and I can be as Christians is a place that is a place of risk, where you're in God's will. He said, if you're taking risk for the Lord, then you're in a safe place. Example is Daniel, where the culture said you can't pray anymore, but 3 times a day he prayed. He was thrown into the den of the lions, very risky, but very safe because God was with him. We as Christians, it seems safer to disengage, but it's much safer to be in God's will. And that's our encouragement. So this morning, I want to motivate you guys that society needs you. You yourself personally need this. And as we do this as Christians, we can be very, very fruitful. Now, right before we go on, I want to just mention one more thing. It's actually more of an anomaly in the Bible for God to use the pastor or the priest or that sort of person. He uses more the general profession of people. You see over and over, there's fishermen, there's tax collectors, there's David was a shepherd. We see Ezra, who's a city official. We saw, or not Ezra was a priest. Nehemiah was a city official. Esther, here in the queen. So your positions, whatever you might be doing, there's value in that, and God wants to use you, even over maybe pastors and those sort of things. So that's our encouragement. That's my encourage. How do you say that word? That's how I encourage you this morning. Very funny. All right, let's turn to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. We're going to look at what does it look like to live as a Christian, to work as a Christian. Romans chapter 12, New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans chapter 12. First 8 chapters of Romans talk about the gospel, the goodness of it, how you're saved. But then Romans chapter 12 tells us how is the gospel lived out? What happens in a person's life when how do you live out the gospel? And Romans chapter 12 verse 1 is going to put this into work clothes for us. Romans chapter 12 verse 1 says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. So in my words here, Paul urges with a great compassion, the word beseech, give your whole life to God. Give your whole self to God. And he says it's a logical, reasonable conclusion after you know what the gospel's done in your life. It's just reasonable. Now let's dig a little deeper. In your Bibles, it says reasonable service. The word service here is the word latria in the Greek. And it's a service that anytime this word service is used throughout the New Testament, it's used in service to God. So a sacred service. And I'm sure any of you, some of you have ESV or a different version. That word is actually translated, instead of reasonable service, it's translated spiritual worship. Your spiritual worship. So Paul, when he explains here, he explained the gospel. And then he says, this is your reasonable response, is to worship God with your life. Your spiritual worship is an offering of yourself. You present your body as a living sacrifice. It means in the Old Testament, would they offer a living sacrifice? No, they'd offer a dead sacrifice. But in the New Testament, where The grace is so much better of God's gospel that you offer yourself unto God to be used as a living sacrifice. And it's an act of worship. So, practically applying this to work. Just like Adam and Eve we saw in the garden before the fall offered themselves as worship, just as Jesus offered his work as worship, and he completed the work of the Father, that was his food, we seek to glorify God in our work as an offering of worship to him. And this is the key. When you work as an act of worship to God, then your faith isn't divided. There's no divide, because your whole life, it's the same thing as too in your play. When you play, and this is you guys watch the movie Chariots of Fire with Eric Little? I love that movie, but he's the one who, when he ran, he felt God's pleasure. He'd throw his head back and run, You remember that? And that it is. It's you're giving your life. My whole life is for the Lord. 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Last time as we left, we'd read the poem, only one life 'twill soon be past, only what's done for Christ will last. And that's what we get to do. Now, after talking about that, you're probably thinking, you're repeating yourself, you talked about that before. What I want to do now is, that's the truth. Our lives are to be an act of spiritual worship. But what does that really look like more practically and word? I need help that way, because it's hard to take. And does that mean I strap myself down and have myself as a sacrifice? No. There's a way to live that out. And let's talk about that. I'm going to give you 4 reasons and 4 ways we do that. And when we do that, I'm going to turn to Ephesians chapter 6. So again, in the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 6, we read a parallel passage in Colossians last time. So 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians. So Ephesians chapter 6. And while you're turning there, I know it's the first of the year is coming up, and this is usually when we get our raises, and we're going to be speaking about bosses and employees here. So I just wanted to give you a little advice. I heard a story, and there was this guy named Mark, and he had walked into his boss's office, and he was a little nervous about it. He decided, but I better do it. He said, sir, I have to be honest with you. I know the economy is tough right now, but there's been 3 other companies that are pursuing me. And I really would like to stay here and work for you, but the wages are good there. And so I want to respectfully ask for a raise. And so his boss, they did a little haggling, and they kind of went back and forth, but his boss finally settled, okay, I'll give you a 5% raise. And they were both happy. Mark was happy. The boss was happy. And as he was leaving, the boss said, hey, would you mind just letting me know what 3 companies were pursuing you? And that's when Mark, he sheepishly said, well, the electric company, the phone company, and the gas company. You get it? It's not as good as Pastor Ron's jokes. All right. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5. Don't use that one, by the way, to get a raise. Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart as to Christ. So bondservants, work for your masters. Be obedient to them. But do it in sincerity, in singleness of heart to Christ. Not with eye service as men pleasers, so not doing it to please man and just when your boss is watching, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will, doing service as to the Lord and not to men. Your service is towards the Lord. Knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. There's going to be a reward in what you do, whether you're a slave or free. And then masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening. Be kind to your employees, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. We began this morning by asking 2 questions. How do we work as Christians in this broken environment, and what makes our Christian work distinct? What's different about it? Romans 12:1 gave us a very broad view of what that means. That means that our Christian distinctly, our work is an act of worship towards God. But here I see 4 principles, and this is really what I want you to take away from today. I really want you to know these things, and I think this is the reason the Lord actually had me share these things on work in the first place, is just to encourage you in these things. And the 4 things we're going to talk about is this, from these verses. Number 1, your work has purpose. It has a purpose. Number 2, your work is very valuable. It's valuable. Number 3, your work thinks of others. It thinks of others. And number 4, your Christian work is for the Lord. This is distinct about Christian work. First, we're going to start about your Christian work has a purpose. Now we see here in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 9, we see it says twice. It says, as to Christ, verse 5, and as to the Lord. So the work is being done for him. Solomon, who we know was the richest or the most wise man in the Bible, he was rich, all the gold he had, silver was like nothing to him, and he tried many things. He wrote songs, he studied biology, he did everything that you could possibly think to enjoy yourself and to learn in this world. And that's when he wrote Ecclesiastes, and we know he was just distraught at that point. And he wrote this in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 17. Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all his vanity and grasping for the wind. So when he did his work, he come to the end of it, all his work under the sun. So not from a perspective of God, but a work under the sun. He says it's all vain. It's a grasping for the wind. And I know when I've done my work for myself or for not thinking about God, it becomes that way. You have this feeling of, what am I doing this for? Just going around in circles, going to work, going to bed, spending, over and over again. And throughout the scriptures, though, and throughout the ages, God has been giving calling and purpose. Christian, I want you to offer your ear. Offer your ear as a living sacrifice to God. One of your acts of spiritual worship, I want to offer your ear. And what is that? I want you to give God the opportunity in your life to speak purpose and calling to you. Purpose and calling to your life. When God calls his calling, he calls the world to salvation. And his primary call to all people is a call to salvation. He says he wants everybody to come to eternal life in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Liberty. He wants people to be free from the law and sin in Galatians 5. He wants us to have fellowship with Christ. He tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And to holy living in 1 Peter. He wants these things for us. He calls us to salvation. Every single person. Now this is a universal calling, but then the calling I'm talking about here is a specific calling. You and I have all been given different a place in life. We're all in the same location together. We're all in the same time together. But we've been given different gifts and interests and all these various things that's God's specific design for you. Turn to 1 Corinthians, back a few books to chapter 7. And this speaks of this calling that is beyond the calling of salvation. It calls your place in life. In this case, a person's actually was saying about slavery was a calling from God for them. It says in verse 20 of chapter 7, verse 20, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 20, it says, let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. So the first calling here is a calling of, I want you to remain in the same calling. That was the thing you're doing right now, in which he was called. So being called was for salvation. So the first calling was the work the person was doing. That was the case of working as a slave. The second was this call of salvation, while he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. So use the place that God's giving you, that calling. For he who is called in the Lord, well, a slave is the Lord's freeman. So he's free if he's in the Lord now because he's been freed by the gospel. Likewise, he was called while free is Christ's slave. Well, if you were free before, well, now you're a slave of Christ. You are bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in the state in which he was called. So is this telling us that every single person is going to stay in the exact same state as when they began, they got saved? No, it's not saying this. But what it is saying is that God has particular callings for you in particular places and times and where you are that he wants to use you in. And I want to encourage you in a few different areas here. 4 of them, actually. I want you to encourage God's sovereignty, God's sovereign placement of where you are. I want to embrace that God has you in a particular place at work or a particular volunteer place in the community or whatever those things are. He guides and leads you into those places. Paul, we saw in the book of Acts, chapter 16, that he wanted to go over here and the Spirit forbid him. He wanted to go over here and the Spirit forbid him, but then he was allowed to go here. Trust that God has directed things where you're there. Just like Jason at Bear Paint, he directed him there. Just like any one of us, Todd being directed, he's at Boeing right now. The Lord has control of that. And trust that. If you have a certain culture that you're brought up in, that you're different than other people around you, trust that culture that you have is going to be used in a certain way with somebody else. Trust God's sovereignty in your life that he can do that. Secondly, I want you to encourage you to use the gifts that God has given you. Romans chapter 12, we just saw, verse 1, talked about the living sacrifice. Well, later on, if you drop down to the chapter, verses 6 or 8 approximately, begins to give this listing of gifts. And the first one's prophecy. The second one is serving. That goes on. There's ones about giving, and there's all these things. It's not a complete list, but it's saying that each person, as you give yourself a living sacrifice, you have gifts to both provide for the church and for your society, the society you live in, the culture you live in. So embrace those gifts. If God has given you the ability to fix cars, do that well. If God's given you a heart to care for the elderly, do that well. Just these things, these gifts that God has, these skills He's given you. If you're good at typing, use that for Him. If you have a niche like my wife does and Jonathan do for accounting, and they love balancing spreadsheets, do that for His glory. If, again, like Heather, you like proofreading, and you just love fixing the commas, do that for His glory. And it can bug someone if they have that gift to not see it right. Use that for God's glory. These are the things you get to embrace your gifts. Also, I encourage you to delight yourself in Him, because this world, though we're Christians, we have the gospel, and we have these giftings, and we can trust His sovereignty, there's certain times, because this world is broken, you're going to end up in a place that, I'm not able to use this gift that I have in the way that I thought I should have been able to, or the time it takes in this position I'm in, it detracts from things that I know that the Lord wants me to do. This is what I want you to encourage you in. I want you to encourage you to delight yourself in the Lord. And many of you know this verse, but Psalm 37:4 says, delight yourself in the Lord, and He'll give you the desires of your heart. Now, if you're in a place of discouragement and you think, I don't know if I'm able to use my gifts, whatever right now, or there's a different time, well, one of two things will happen. If you delight yourself in the Lord, then He's going to direct you to some place where He wants you to be instead, because He's going to give you those desires. Or He's going to change the very desires in you. So the place that you're at right now, then you're going to enjoy those things. You're going to be able to see Him in a different way. So delight yourself in the Lord. And the last one I want to encourage you in this is that as you offer your ear to God and His callings for you, seek other counsel. Find someone who's a follower of the Lord, who's strong, and that knows you. And ask them about, what do you see in my life? Am I being used with the gifts I have? How might I be a little bit different? I would especially encourage you, if you know another Christian in your workplace who knows the same field as you, ask them, what counsel you can give me to help in that way. So Proverbs 19:20 says, listen to counsel and receive instruction, that you may be wise in your latter days. So, in conclusion of this, offer your ear to God. Accept His callings for your life. This is where you're going to receive purpose in your workplace. You won't feel like you're just spinning your wheels. You're going to be the most fruitful and the most fulfilled. But remember, it takes patience, because we're living in a fallen world. World. Pastor John Corson, he says that one of the reasons it's hard to be a living sacrifice is because living sacrifices, you put them on the altar and they try to crawl off because they're living. And I like that, because it's not easy at times to be a living sacrifice when you offer yourself to the Lord. Number 2, your Christian work is valuable. The good you do will be rewarded by the one who gives every good and perfect gift. We can be assured of that. Why? Because Ephesians says, whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether a slave or free. Whatever good anyone does. And Colossians, the parallel verse said, we reward it. It's a guarantee. Now, it's not a guarantee if you're not working for the Lord, because Solomon, again, in Ecclesiastes 2:11, what happened to him? He said, then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. There was no profit in it, because he did it for self under the sun. But good works in Christ, they pay eternal dividends. If you look at the context here of Ephesians, you're seeing the bondservants are instructed here to do this labor for him. And their works are valuable no matter what they are. If you're using your mind for the Lord or using your hands for the Lord, it's valuable. There's a quote here we're going to show from Martin Luther. And I wasn't really aware of this. I guess it's probably just my own lack of understanding or knowledge. But during the Reformation time, one of the huge things at that time was that in the Catholic Church, which was really the only church at the time, the position of the monk or the priest was sacred, and the position of someone who was a standard worker or a person at home, there was no worth, value in the sense of the Lord. That you had to be in this place to have the value from the Lord and the things you did. And so Martin Luther says this. He says, "It looks like a great thing when a monk renounces everything and goes into a cloister, carries on a life of asceticism, fasts, watches, prays, etc. On the other hand, it looks like a small thing when a young lady cooks and cleans and does her other household work, other housework. But because God's command is there, even such a small work must be praised as service to God, far surpassing the holiness and asceticism of all monks and nuns. For here there is no command of God, but there God's command is fulfilled that one should honor father and mother and help in the care of the home." So he's saying, there wasn't a command for the monks to do these things they're doing, but there was a command for this young lady to honor her father and mother and to work and care of the home. That's honoring, that's valuable to God. So in this portion about your work is valuable, I want to exhort you, Christian, to offer your hands and your feet as a living sacrifice to the Lord. Give of your effort. Give of your skills. Work hard for the Lord. If you're a secretary, do that. If you're a cook, if you're an editor, there's eternal value in the things that you're doing working hard from the Lord. Again, like if you have skills, as like a guy named Gary Stutz back there, if you have skills in fixing a car and working on it, do that. I enjoy watching people like Gary work. I enjoy watching a guy like Steve Jones, where he does his tile work, and it turns out, you just look at it afterwards, it's beautiful. It's neat. I personally enjoy, I like looking at clean computer code afterwards, how it's nice and formatted and it works well, it's efficient. These are things that are good. If you have been given the gift of being a mom and you get to wipe the runny nose, enjoy that. If you're someone who works at Safeway and you get to clean up the spill on aisle 12, enjoy that. Do that. Do that for the Lord. The Lord definitely blesses people with skills that are not just what you'd consider spiritual skills. The Old Testament story you guys know of, I hope I said his name right, Bezaleel and Aholiab, they were giving spiritual skills to make the tabernacle. And it says in Exodus, I'll just read a few parts of it, it says, to design artistic works in gold and silver and bronze and cutting jewels for setting and carving wood and to work in all manner of workmanship. I have filled him with the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God does that in one's life. And so do those things unto the Lord. So Christian, your work is valuable. You may not see it right now, but I can guarantee by God's word, when work is done for the Lord, it will be valuable because he will reward you. It tells us that in Ephesians. And if you feel defeated right now, offer your hands and your feet to the Lord as an offering. Did we get that? Defeated? No, we got it. Wasn't a very good joke. All right. Okay, number 3. Your Christian work thinks of others. Your Christian work thinks of others. It says in Ephesians, bondservants, be obedient. Masters, give up threatening. There's an others focused. And this is a very, very important about Christian work. We're not focused on self, we're focused on others. This is very distinct. Timothy Keller, he wrote a book called Every Good Endeavor, and I would encourage anybody who wants to learn more in this area of work to read it. It's a book I've read, just recently read it as part of the study of studying. And he wrote this. We're to see work as a way of service to God and our neighbor. And so we should both choose and conduct our work in accordance with that purpose. The question regarding our choice of work is no longer what will make me the most money and give me the most status. The question must now be, how, with my existing abilities and opportunities, can I be of greatest service to others, knowing what I do of God's will and of human need? So he's saying here that our skills and our labor should be directed towards others. And I think this is especially true for you who don't have a profession. If you're a young person, you're just starting out right now or just still in school, think about my future. What will I do? Try to choose something where you can be a service to others, where you can be of impact for others, not just for self. For us who are already in the workplace, we trust God has us in these places, and we want to use wherever we're at to serve others. Solomon, Ecclesiastes again, one of the reasons he said that all this was in vain, listen to this quote from Ecclesiastes chapter 2. How many times he uses the word I? I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants and had servants in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. You see how many times it says I and my and myself? This is why at the end of his life he says all is vanity. It wasn't directed towards others. So Christian, I encourage you to open your eyes. Give your eyes as a living sacrifice to God. Give your eyes over. What does this mean? Look around you. Look at the brokenness of people, both Christians and non-Christians, in your workplaces, in the schools that you're in, at your homes. Look around, open your eyes and see that. See, we can be so narrow-focused on things. We can really want to win the argument at work or win the argument at home. We can be involved in the office politics. Like there's a particular hire going to be made, and you want to have your input on who it is. And you can be so focused on that it ruins your ability to relate to others and see your eyes. Jesus is the greatest example of this, and probably one of the verses I love more than any other. At least I read it the most often. Matthew 9:36. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered like sheep, having no shepherd. Why was he moved? He was moved with compassion. He saw they were weary and scattered. I want us to open our eyes in the workplace. Each person, as we know, we saw yesterday, last week, we saw it was created in the image of God, and God desires to have fellowship with each one. Now, here's some difficulties in this area. If you're a person like me who's task-oriented, and you want to get that thing done, and you work hard at it, and you're going to accomplish it, you have a tendency to focus on that, and you can't focus on things around you. Or, how many of this experience? There are people around you that you're a bit jealous of, who maybe they're people who just don't want anything to do with God, and even haters of God, but they're better at what they do than you do. And they're the ones who get the raises, or they're the ones that do the better projects, and they get the praise a lot of times. When that happens, we can begin to think, why is that? And you become narrow-focused upon yourself. What we have to recognize that is this. That person has been given those gifts as what is a grace of God. God gives, it says he reigns in the just and the unjust. He gives grace to all peoples. They're created in his image, and he gives certain talents to certain people, even though they want to embrace it from God. And so in that, we just have to open our eyes and say, okay, Lord, you've given great blessing to that person. When I was working at Boeing, there were some very smart people, at least in my opinion they were. And it was hard to keep up. But you just had to learn, okay, I'm going to be thankful that I get to be around people like this, because they raise the level on me. They help me become better. And so you look beyond yourself and you open your eyes. So in conclusion of that, let's open our eyes with compassion. Offer your eyes as a living sacrifice. And there is that person, maybe at Will's work, where they would look for anything to see weakness so they can hurt him. But don't worry about it. Have the eyes of compassion of Christ. That's what's going to be better in the long run. All right. Last one, number 4, and probably the most important. Your Christian work is for the Lord. Your Christian work is for the Lord. It says, as bondservants of Christ in Ephesians. This is probably the most defining mark of the Christian work, is that we live in this broken world, but as Jesus said, our kingdom is not of this world. We have a boss who's on the biggest org chart you can think. He's always at the top. And our stock is not dependent upon the frailty of this life. God is whom we serve. And everyone is going to serve, someone in this. Everyone's going to have a boss. And here's my couple of just warnings first. Many will work for their boss. And this is Christian and non-Christian. If you're a person who is a man pleaser, and you're always worried about what other people think, or you want to raise the bar, it even happens, in the church where someone tries to please the pastor. They'll come up to the pastor and they always want to tell him a little bit about what they did good. They're trying to please, get the acceptance. A man pleaser is never going to be pleased. You have to work for the Lord. The reality is, if you're a man pleaser, then you're going to have a feeling of hopelessness inside, like you don't measure up. You're also going to feel like you're just being used by someone else. You're going to feel demeaned on the inside. And this is when someone ends up calling work works another 4-letter word. That's what you feel like when you're just working for the paycheck and you're working for the boss. Also, people work for themselves. We've talked about this, but people work for pleasure. How can I work hard where I get the nicer car, the better iPad, the vacation, whatever it might be? How can I get the next latest gadget? Or money. How do I accumulate wealth and be secure? Or power and status, making the name for self. Now, we all know that these things, they're very fickle friends because they always dry up. And Solomon, we refer back to him again, in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, at the end of all that, what he said, his conclusion was, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, fear God and keep his commandments. It's about the Lord and not about these things. He had everything. Now, this is embarrassing to admit, but I know everyone else here probably knows as well. If you've seen the news, watching Miley Cyrus, and just where she went from being in this place of, a young, attractive future for this young lady, and then she goes to being someone who she just made herself look like trash, the other side of it. And it's about status, it's about power and money and all these things, and she made that decision. And it's sad because, you see that over, Britney Spears basically did the same thing, it appears like, then you have Madonna and all these people, over and over it happens. And we as a society are so tricked, and we think, let me change myself, increase my status, and then eventually it just becomes vanity. It's all vanity. And even her dad says, Miley's just being herself. And how sad of a thing that you think that these things are going to please when they're all vanity. So Christian, the last thing for us, I have to say, offer your heart as a living sacrifice to God. Give him your affections. So flee the desire to please man. If that's you, flee that desire. Proverbs 29:25, the fear of man brings a snare. Whatever trust in the Lord shall be safe. If you're trying to please man, you're going to be in a snare. It's going to hurt you. Pleasure. Reject the push to enjoy yourself from your work, in the sense of, gaining wealth, you can enjoy yourself. Now, what you can do, though, as a Christian worker, is very distinct. This is what I know, we know this. In the midst of failures, show that you have hope. A mark of a Christian worker is that when the numbers are down or the project doesn't work out, you can profess, you can trust in the hope of God. There's hope beyond this. Or in the midst of trouble, maybe when you're at work and something happens with your family, or there's layoffs, display faith in his faithfulness for you. And it's a witness, and it shows what God's done. Now, the next one, money. We haven't talked about money very much, and we've been talking about work for probably 2 hours now. And money is an important part of work. I don't think, probably many of us would be doing something different a lot of times if we didn't get money. So money is important to work. But money for the Christian is very distinct. Definitely money for the Christian, but it shouldn't be something that we're storing up treasures, because Jesus tells us that man's a fool, he said. But what do we do with money? Is money a bad thing? Is it bad? No, it's not. The Lord, we know, he can use money. But what does the Word instruct us? Well, the Word instructs us in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. It says, let him who stole steal no longer, rather than labor. So in the past, you were living for yourself. this case stealing, but there's a lot of ways we live for ourselves. He says, but rather let him labor. That means work hard. Working with his hands what is good. Be about the things of working hard. And then what is the conclusion of that? He says that he may have something to give him who has need. A distinct mark of the Christian worker is generosity. Giving of your labors, the work that you've done, the heart and giving of others. And I think this is definitely true for us to give to the works of the Lord, but it's also true that I think we just need to be generous with, maybe there's someone at work that is going through a hard time, that you should be buying a turkey dinner for them, or giving them $500 to pay for their rent, whatever it might be. Being generous, that's a mark of a Christian that's going to stand out. And lastly, the area of power. Instead of gathering power for ourselves, we have to display a dependence upon God, a mark of a Christian. Dependence upon God. Show your need when you have that hard problem at work where nobody seems to have the solution or you don't have the solution. Show dependence upon God that I need you, Lord, in this. I know there was a numbers of times where I was stuck on a computer program, couldn't figure it out for multiple days. Show a dependence upon God. Look to his power for it. Still, I showed a dependence upon God yesterday. God, help me with this message. Dependence upon God for the things he does. So, to conclude all this, the reason that we have focused here is really this. As you guys leave here and you go out and do the things that the Lord has you in the places you are, remember these things, that you have a purpose, that there's value in what you're doing. And work to help others and direct your work towards God. And I just hope that this study just is helpful in that way. This Wednesday, you guys are not going to want to miss that because Heather and Myron are going to be sharing. We've been talking about kind of what the Word says, but here's putting the work clothes on. If you missed the men's breakfast, I know ladies missed the men's breakfast for sure, unless you snuck in. Those were really good. We heard from 3 men about how the Lord uses them there. You want to listen to that online. This is an important area, I think. It's just an important area because this is where we spend our time. The world needs complete Christians. The world needs complete Christians. People who love Christ, who are spiritually motivated, that are compassionate towards others. This is what we need. I want to invite the worship team to come up.